Hi everyone, welcome to the pre-application webinar for Libraries Transforming Communities, Accessible Small and Rural Communities. In this session, we will be covering everything you need to be aware of in order to apply for one of the $10,000 or $20,000 grants. Before we dig in, I'd like to briefly introduce myself. My name is Samantha Oakley, and I'm the director of the Libraries Transforming Communities project and a project director in the American Library Association's Public Programs Office. Throughout this session, I'll be taking you through the grant guidelines, providing you with tips on how to write a competitive application, and showing you how to submit your proposal using ALA's grant application system. I also want to note, as Kayleen mentioned earlier, that we will have time at the end of the session for Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can feel free to put those in the Q&A box towards the bottom of the window, and we'll do our best to get through everyone's questions at the end of today's webinar. So Libraries Transforming Communities, or LTC for short, Accessible Small and Rural Libraries, is an initiative that seeks to provide community engagement and accessibility resources to small and rural libraries to help them better serve people with disabilities. Up to 300 libraries will be selected in this application period, which is currently open until December 11th, 2024. In total, ALA will be distributing up to $3.5 million to small and rural libraries in this round of the grant opportunity. For those of you who may be less familiar with the term community engagement, it is the process of working collaboratively with community members, be they library patrons, residents, faculty, student, or partner organizations, for the betterment of the community. As champions of lifelong learning, libraries are a place to stimulate curiosity, access technology, and explore new ideas, hobbies, and careers. Increasingly, libraries also offer patrons welcoming physical and virtual spaces to meet their neighbors to discuss and resolve important issues. This grant, offered in partnership with the Association for Rural and Small Libraries, is designed to provide training and funding to help support small and rural libraries in implementing a community engagement project to better serve people with disabilities. So, what do you need to know before applying for one of these grants? First, you'll need to check that you are eligible for this opportunity. The good news is that this grant is open to all types of libraries, including public, academic, community college, K through 12, tribal libraries, and special libraries. However, the applicant library must serve a small and rural community in the U.S. or U.S. territory. What defines a small and rural library? According to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, these are libraries situated in an area that is at least 5 miles from an urbanized area and has a population of 25,000 or less. Additionally, it's worth mentioning here that previous recipients of LTC or ALA grants are eligible for this opportunity. If you have questions about whether your library qualifies as small and rural, you can email us at publicprograms@ala.org and we will assist you in determining your eligibility. So let's talk about what to do once you've gone through the eligibility requirements and determined that you qualify to apply for one of the grants. What is it exactly that your library will get? If selected for funding, you will receive $10,000 or $20,000 to support costs related to your community engagement project, virtual training to assist you in developing your community engagement, facilitation, and disability service skills, a suite of online resources developed to support local programs, including template press releases, social media messaging, logos, digital promotional materials, and template letters that can be used to notify local leaders about the library's project. You'll also get technical and project support from ALA's Public Programs Office throughout the grant term. This includes access to online learning opportunities for grantees intended to assist in promoting their projects, completing grant reporting requirements, and participating in evaluation. You'll also get access to a community of practice for project directors and staff so that you can connect with others also working on their grant projects. Now that we've covered what your library will receive, let's talk about what you'll be required to do. First, The person leading the grant project at your library will need to participate in the LTC Facilitation Skills for Small and Rural Libraries asynchronous e-course. We estimate that this course will take approximately 4 hours to complete. The course walks you through everything you need to know about leading a community conversation, from what to do when planning a conversation, how to facilitate the discussion on the day of the event, and what should be done afterward to follow up with participants. Project directors will also be required to participate in Disability and Community Engagement 101 trainings. We estimate that these 2 sessions will take a total of 2.5 hours to complete. They will walk you through accessibility basics, provide an overview of the Americans with Disabilities Act, provide tips for engaging patrons with disabilities in your project, and more. Once the project director completes the e-course, you will need to host at least one group conversation with your primary audience identified in the proposal. Your conversation should focus on discussing accessibility in the community and library in order to collaboratively identify existing resources, needs, and priorities. Conversations can be in person, virtual, or hybrid. They can also take place in or outside of the library, whatever works best for the audience you choose. Based on the conversation outcomes, the library will revise their preliminary project plan to align with the needs and priorities of their primary audience. Sites will be expected to revise or affirm their preliminary plans based on the outcomes of the conversation in an interim report, which will be due 6 months into your grant period. In addition to updating project plans, you should be prepared to share information about next steps from the conversation with the primary audience and invite their feedback on the project plans. You'll also want to share outcomes wider. You can do this by using PLA's Project Outcome, Community Engagement, or ACRL's Project Outcome Events and Programs areas to collect and share feedback about the conversation with library leadership and trustees. Write an article and submit it to a local newspaper or other media outlet, or post it to this library's social media. Create a video and post it to the library's YouTube, Facebook, or other social media account. Write and send a letter or email to a state or local elected official about the conversation, or create a library blog post or podcast session about the issues discussed during the conversation and about the process itself. You will also be required to spend the money within the grant period, and the grant period will be from May 1st, 2025 until April 30th, 2026. LTC grant funds are restricted to project-related expenses. Eligible expenses may include, but are not limited to, library staff time, honoraria for conversation participants, payment to project partners for reimbursement or direct funding of services and support provided, for example, paying for ASL interpreters or live captioners. You can also use the funds to pay for facility upgrades. This can include things like automatic door openers, accessible signage, sensory space equipment, etc. It can also be used for tech equipment, such as braillers, iPads, virtual meeting licenses, books or other collection materials, training for library staff, such as disability inclusion training, project supplies, such as markers, index cards, Post-its, and promotion and publicity costs. Grant funds may not be used to support indirect costs, for example, general library administrative expenses, or for donations to other organizations. Now that we've gone over all the requirements, let's dive into the actual proposal. For this, I'll be walking you through the various application components in our grants management platform. To access the application, click Apply Online on the Grant Opportunity Information page. This will open the login page for the grants platform in a new window. If you have previously used the system to apply for a grant through ALA's Public Programs Office, simply enter your email address and password and log in. Note that your login information for the grant platform is not the same as your login information if you have an ALA membership. This is a separate system. If you have not used the system, click Create New Account to set up a profile. However, if you believe that someone else at your organization may have already created an account to apply for a different grant opportunity, please click the link to verify with our grant administrator before setting up a new account. If you need to create an account, you will be asked to provide organization information, user information, and executive director information. This will include an option to select if the user is the executive director. Fill in the required fields and click the next button to navigate through these sections. Once you get to the final section, create a password and then click Create Account. You will receive an email verification to the email address provided. Once you receive this email, click I have received this email to continue. Once you have completed setting up your new account, you will be brought to this screen that you see on the PowerPoint. However, if you are logging in to a previously used account, you will instead be brought to the applicant dashboard. To access the list of open opportunities, click Apply in the top left corner. On the Apply screen, find PPO LTC Accessible Small and Rural Communities Round 3 and the list of open opportunities. From here, you can review the project guidelines or click Apply to begin your application. You will now be in the application. In the instruction sections, simply type LTC Access 3 in the project name field. You'll be asked to identify if you were awarded a grant in round 1 and/or round 2 of this initiative. You will also need to indicate if you are applying for only a $10,000 grant, only a $20,000 grant, or if you are applying for either of those grant amounts. If you select that you would like to be considered for either $10,000 or $20,000, your application will first be considered for the higher amount. If your proposal is not awarded at the $20,000 level, it will then be considered for the $10,000 award. The next section is the project director one. Please fill out the contact information for the project director. Note that this information will not be pre-populated from your user profile, and the project director is the person that will be responsible for carrying out things such as completing grant reports and filling out the LOA. The next section is where you will need to enter information about your library. This includes its congressional district. If you do not know this information, you can click the link labeled United States House of Representatives, and the Find Your Representative website will be opened in a new window. You can then locate your representative by typing in your zip code and your the location, the address of your library. You'll also be asked for some standard information such as library type, community type, and population size. You'll select your answers for these 3 questions using the drop-down menus on the form. You'll also be asked to identify how you learned about this opportunity. Section 4 is where we will really get into the meat of your proposal. This is the narrative section. This is where you will be going to explain what you are proposing. Links are provided to the grant guidelines, and we strongly encourage you to read these before preparing your responses, as they may help you structure your plan. We also suggest you take a look at the rubric that peer reviewers will be using to rate applications. You can find a link to the rubric in the grant guidelines. Within the grant guidelines, you can also find examples of previous successful applicants, proposals, and some budget examples, which are helpful for filling out the proposal. For each narrative field, the responses are limited to 2,000 characters, which includes spaces. So you may want to prepare your answers in Microsoft Word or another document and paste it into the application when you're ready so that the character count is a little bit easier to track. For the first narrative field, you'll need to provide information about your community and library. This includes demographics, dynamics, and key issues or challenges it faces. When writing your response, be sure to include what reviewers should know about your library and community in order to understand your proposed community engagement project. To make your response as strong as possible, be sure to connect the information you're providing to the project you're proposing and avoid superfluous details that don't connect back to what you're what your project is about. The second narrative field asks you to describe the primary audience of your project. In your response, you should include details about why you chose to focus on your identified audience, how, if at all, you currently serve this audience, what your plans are for outreach efforts to engage the audience throughout the project, and what your overarching goals are for engaging them with your project. Also, just a reminder that the intent of this grant is to help you better serve people with disabilities in your community. So your primary audience should be individuals with disabilities. For example, adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, children with learning disabilities, older adults who are blind or who have low vision, etc. The third narrative field inquires about the rationale of your project. Specifically, we want to know what challenge or opportunity your project aims to address for the primary audience. We are looking for information on how you identify this challenge or opportunity, so please describe how you use relevant information from reliable sources to define the need, challenge, or opportunity you seek to address. The fourth field pertains to your project plans. In your response, please outline your preliminary plan for addressing the identified challenge or opportunity. What activities will you carry out to execute the plan? How has the input of the primary audience influenced it? How will you continue to incorporate the perspectives and input of your primary audience throughout the project? Additionally, how will you share information about the project and its outcomes? Do you have any community partners in mind, existing or new, that you plan to engage in the process? If so, also include them here. We understand that you may not have had your conversation with your primary audience at the time of submitting your application. Therefore, what you're seeking to address may change based on the outcomes of that discussion if you're awarded. This is completely okay, and the project is designed to maintain that flexibility. Your project should be guided by the audience it seeks to serve. If, after your conversation, you find that you need to tweak or completely change your plans based on what your primary audience has prioritized, that is okay. After your conversation, you will be asked to either revise or affirm your preliminary plans based on the outcomes of the conversation by submitting a short form to ALA. Also, an important note for libraries who previously received LTC Round 1 or Round 2 grants. In this section, you need to discuss how your proposed plan either expands upon the work of your previous award or is different from your prior project. Please note that the reviewers will not have access to your previous proposals or reports, so write this information for someone with no understanding of what you previously did. The next section is where you'll enter your budget details. What this section looks like will depend on the level of funding you are seeking. So if you're seeking only $10,000, you'll see just one field where you'll need to enter what you will use the funding to purchase or support. The total amount of your proposed budget plan would need to add up to just $10,000. This will be the same for the only $20,000 option, except your budget plan would need to add up to $20,000. If you are applying for either $10,000 or $20,000, you'll see two fields in this section. In the two fields, you will need to describe your budget plans for $20,000 in the appropriate field. For the other field, you will describe how your plans would adjust or change if you were awarded at the $10,000 amount. Please note that if you choose this option, you will first be considered for an award at the higher level. If not selected for $20,000, you will then be considered for the lower amount. We do recommend that if your plans that you're proposing can be done at a lower amount, you apply for either option just to increase your chances, because we are giving 50 $20,000 awards and we're giving 250 $10,000 awards. So your chances are a little bit higher for 10,000. When filling out this section of your proposal, please be sure to refer back to the eligible expenses listed on the grant guidelines to ensure that your proposed spending is within the eligible expenses. Also, please keep in mind the following guidance for your budget. You should write the budget in a list format. For example, bullet one, $5,000 for automatic door opener installation, bullet two, $1,000 for staff training, etc. You can look at examples in the guidelines that shows you a little more details about what we're looking for in that list. You should also ensure that your costs align with the proposed project. The budget items should directly relate to the project you are proposing. For instance, if your proposal is about accessible library signage and assistive equipment for individuals with low vision, make sure your budget reflects this need and is not something unrelated. Or if it seems like something that is not directly connected to or easily connected to what you propose, maybe add a little description there for the peer reviewers about how it relates to your proposed project. Otherwise, they're going to think it's a superfluous expense. You should also provide a basis for the costs you list. You can use quotes from vendors, known local prices of materials, or cost listing from online vendors. It's really important to research and base your costs on the specific area where your project will take place, especially for construction-based projects where your specific location can greatly influence costs. We've seen too many libraries get into where they looked at the costs for doing a construction project in Maine, but they're in Alaska, and Alaska's shipment prices and material costs are a lot more than Maine, and their budget completely blew up. So really make sure that you are researching your local costs. You should also double check that your budget totals either $10,000 or $20,000. If your project exceeds these amounts, explain how the library plans to cover costs above that grant amount. For instance, if your project costs $40,000, clarify how the additional $20,000 will be provided as matching support by the township or through another grant that you already have in the door. In section 6, you can upload any letters of support from your community or additional materials that may help provide more information about your proposal. This can be things such as sample promotional materials or draft discussion questions. Please note that this section is optional. However, it may help make your application more competitive. In the final section, you will need to provide contact information for a certifying official. This individual should be someone from your library who has the authority to submit funding applications on behalf of the institution. While this role can vary on the library, it is typically filled by the director. It can be the same person listed as the project director or the person submitting the proposal, as long as they have the authority to submit funding applications for their institution. You will be required to confirm that your organization is not presently debarred, suspended, proposed for debarment, declared ineligible, or voluntarily excluded from participating in this transaction by any federal department or agency. To verify the status of your institution, please click the System for Award Management link in the proposal that you'll see. This will open the sam.gov website in a new window where you can search for your institution and confirm that your organization is not listed as ineligible. Once you have completed all the necessary information, you can submit your application. Please note that once you submit, you will no longer be able to edit your proposal. If you are not ready to submit yet, you can save your application. This will allow you to access your draft when you log back into your account using the Edit Application link. So to wrap things up before we move to questions, a few tips to keep in mind as you work on your proposal. As I've mentioned repeatedly throughout this presentation, and I'm going to reiterate again here because it's so important. Please read the grant guidelines. They contain crucial information necessary to make your application competitive and ensure that you are meeting the requirements of a successful application. You should also answer all of the questions in the application thoroughly and provide as much detail as possible for each narrative response. Consider what reviewers should know about your library and community in order to understand your proposed community engagement project. You should assume that reviewers know nothing about your library or its work, and be sure to take as much time as needed to provide them the level of detail they will need to fully understand your community, your primary audience, your project plans, things like that. So we advise against submitting two-sentence answers to responses because in general those don't give enough details for the reviewers to consider your application competitive. Also, whenever possible, you should provide numbers and examples to support your statements in the narrative. For example, if you claim that your town has a higher than average percentage of individuals with disabilities for your state, consider including relevant census data to support your statement. This really helps to make your application stronger and provide access to the reviewers about where your information is coming from. You should also seek out community partners who are willing to collaborate on your project. While not mandatory, having a partner can greatly help in reaching different members of your community. Your partners can be anything from a local school, a fraternal society like your local Elks Club, American Legion, Moose Lodge, all those Rotary clubs, those type of organizations, 4-H's, whatever makes sense for your community and which would help you reach your audience. We've also seen a lot of people working with centers for independent living and senior centers, things like that. So again, it's not mandatory to have a community partner. We know some folks are hours away from a partner organization and it's just not feasible. So it's optional, but it does help. And along these lines, although also optional, we recommend collecting letters of support from community stakeholders to demonstrate a community commitment. This can show peer reviewers the level of support and interest in your community has for the project. Letters of support do not necessarily have to come from organizations. They can come from library patrons. So if you have a library patron that's really passionate about this project and wants to write a letter of support for it, that is perfectly fine. We've seen some libraries have had kids write letters for a kid-focused project about how much the grant project would mean to them. And we've also seen community partner letters, such as the ones that I've mentioned earlier from leaders at those organizations. And lastly, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the Public Programs Office at publicprograms@ala.org. We will also be offering one-on-one sessions for anyone who would be interested in just talking to one of our staff to brainstorm if their idea sounds eligible or if their library is eligible, things like that. And we will share out a link to where you can sign up for a time slot with you shortly after this webinar. With that, I want to thank you all for listening to this presentation and also thank my colleague Colleen for all her support throughout this session. We will now open the chat and Q&A to respond to questions you may have.
Yeah, so we have a good amount in the Q&A, so let's just go ahead and get started. So the first question is, will the grant cover furniture for a new library being built? So I think furniture is definitely an eligible expense. But I think specifically, if the project is we're building a new library, can we use it to purchase furniture? Not necessarily. I think the project has to specifically be about a primary audience of people with a disability and their need being furniture that is more accessible. And then the funds could be used for purchasing of furniture. So you see how those can be, those are slightly different. Um, so furniture itself is an eligible expense, but with a different slant to why it's needed. Do you have anything else to add to that, Sam?
Um, no, just really that, as you mentioned, the intent of this grant and things that we don't want people to lose sight of is that this is really seeking to address the needs and um, priorities of people with disabilities in your community. And if they're like, the thing that we need most is accessible um, furniture in the new library, then that's eligible. But if you have your community conversation and they're like, no, actually, we need, I don't know, an accessible pathway to the library first, then you would have to pivot your project to provide that pathway.
Exactly. Next question. Would a branch of a county system which serves a small and rural community be eligible? Definitely. I think we get this question a lot. When we're referring to the small and rural eligibility specifications, we are referring to the town in which your library is located. So we're not referring to your service population. We're referring to, the population of where you are located. So the branch library of where you are, where that branch is located, if it is small and rural, then yes, it is eligible. So you don't have to worry about your service population because we realize that a lot of small and rural libraries serve full counties or multiple counties, um, which would obviously be much larger than that small population size. Um, so yes, if the location of that branch library is small and rural, it is eligible. And just a reminder, to please put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat, because it's easy to miss those in the chat. Thank you. And I saw this one come in when we were discussing project director. So I think this is what they're referring to. Would our librarian be our executive director? I think they mean project director. It's really, the project director is whoever's going to be the person running the project, doing the majority of the project responsibilities. So that could be, your library director. For some of our grantees, it is not the library director. It is, a programming librarian or someone else. So it's really just whoever is going to be the one, responsible for managing this grant at their library. That's who your project director will be. Next question. If we don't end up spending the total grant award, say the bids come in for the estimate, and I'm guessing you meant, and then you spend, the estimate comes in higher, and then what you end up spending, do we return the excess award? No. You, based on your conversation, spend the remainder on other accessibility needs that were mentioned. So let's say the estimate was on, accessible pathway, like Sam mentioned earlier. But during the conversation, other things that people mentioned were expanding your large print books and expanding your audiobooks, or having magnifying readers and those kind of things available. Then you can also use whatever's left over to buy a couple of those kind of things. So you find smaller projects that you can spend the remaining funds on. Next question. We are applying to expand our LTC2 project. Can this grant go toward funding additional needs discovered from the LTC2 community conversation? Absolutely. That is a great way to use what you've discovered from that conversation. As we noted, be sure to explain that in your application, since the reviewers won't have any information about your LTC2 project. But also note that even though it came from a conversation already, you will still need to fulfill the requirement in this round of LTC3 to host another community conversation discussing this project idea. Any other thoughts on that one, Sam?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay. Can the grant be used for staff if they are the project director? Yeah, staff time is something we see a lot on the budget. You're working on this a lot. If you're, working directly on this project, you can definitely use some of the budget to cover the expenses of your staff time. Like we mentioned, the only ineligible expense are really indirect costs. So if it's not directly related to the grant, then you can't use grant funds for it. Okay, the courses and community conversations happen after the grant is awarded, correct? And I see a couple of other mentions of this. That is correct. The community conversation must occur after you are awarded. This, the requirement of the community conversation must occur during the implementation period. So if you would like, you can host a conversation to get ideas for your application, but that conversation will not fulfill the requirement for during your implementation period. You will have to host another conversation during your implementation period about this project and about accessibility in your library, and discussing your project plans and what to do with funds with your primary audience. So you will have to do one during the implementation period. And this is the same for the courses. If you were a previous grantee and completed the facilitation e-course previously, you don't have to do it again. But you do not have to complete the e-course before applying.
I'm going to jump in and answer a few questions that I'm seeing repeating.
Yes. Yeah.
So I've seen some questions around if match is required for this grant. No, match is not required for the grant. We just ask that if your project is over the amount of your the grant amount that we're offering, then you just need to clarify where you will get those additional funds from in order to complete your project within the year grant implementation timeline. But just to reiterate again, match is not required at all. So if your project is $10,000 or $20,000 total, you're good. You don't need to get a match. Also, I've seen some questions around sam.gov. So these are not federal grant funds. You are not required to have a SAM unique uh, entity identifier number for this. SAM.gov we only recommend using to check if your library is debarred or suspended from receiving funding. So I just suggest that as a tool. But in general, you probably know if your library is already within that or not. You also do not need to be a member of ALA to apply for this grant. I've seen a few questions around that. And the question about eligibility around the location of your library, the 5 miles from an urbanized area is generally from town center, I would say, as long as your borders aren't a suburb essentially where your town is touching like I don't know Chicago, and you clearly have urbanized area going through those borders. If most of your town is like in this little pocket, your downtown area, and then you have like 10 miles of rural area until you reach the actual edges of the urban community, then you qualify. I think those are the only repeating questions that I've seen so far.
Yes. Thank you for jumping in to answer some of those. And please remember to drop your questions in the Q&A. Okay, so the next question, what kind of demographic info would be helpful for this?
Yeah, it depends on what your proposal looks like. So if you are saying, as I mentioned, that your library is seeking to serve individuals with disabilities, and you're seeking to serve, let's say, any type of disability within your community, and it's because you have like a very large disabled community, according to census data, then you just drop in the census data information. You'll also want to add things like your community size is always good to know for reviewers because they might not look at the little drop down menu, or you might want to clarify because 5,000 is the lowest we go in the population size. And I know a lot of folks are in areas with a population size a lot smaller than that. So you might want to be saying, we're in rural Idaho and our population is 500 people, just so that they get the sense of the scope of the community.
Great, thanks. Next question is, what counts as a community partner? Do they need to contribute financially, help with planning?
So a community partner is anyone that contributes to the project in some way. So, and by contributing, I mean they could help with planning. That would be a community partner. They could even help with just marketing and outreach to the audience you are seeking to serve. So, for instance, you might partner with the church because you know that the church has a group of individuals who are disabled that routinely use their like space, and so they would be a great trusted partner to get word out about your project to that community. And they don't need to contribute financially, just to answer that part.
Yeah, definitely not. Um, I'm trying to think of some examples of people who have, community partners have just been, oh, I got distracted by the thumbs up and the hearts. Just for, if they've gone and partnered with like the facilities where adults with developmental disabilities live, and they've decided to you know set up a program with that facility. You can list that as a partner organization, because you're working together. So it's as simple as that. um I think this question is, I think, a good one where we can highlight our FAQ question where we define disability and give some examples. This one is discussing boarding school where they have students with learning disabilities, and would that be eligible to apply as the primary audience? Yes, absolutely. Learning disabilities are disability, and that could be your primary audience. We have a very thorough FAQ, but I'm going to directly link the question where we define disability and give some examples of disabilities. Some are obvious and some are, ones that you might not typically think of when you think of disability. And obviously the list is not exhaustive. It's not everything, but it will kind of give you a better idea of what we mean when we discuss the primary audience and what you can include and what you cannot include. Next question, are municipal libraries able to apply?
Yes.
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, as long as you fit the definition of small and rural, you're eligible. I know that we have some county systems that technically, because they band together, their service population might be like a lot higher than 25K, but the individual branches within their system serve very tiny, very rural communities. So that's why we go with the population of where the library is located rather than the service population.
Joy is asking about, interested in the one-on-one sessions. Those a link to those will be available on the application resources webpage, which I previously linked in the chat, but it's also on the homepage of LTC / LTC access. Yeah, ala.org / LTC access. And you'll see one of the bullets is application resources. And among those things, you'll see application examples, budget examples, and when it is available, which will be shortly, we will have a kind of calendar become available for you to select and schedule some one-on-one time to discuss your application. All right. Would revamping our computer area to better serve our older population and those with disabilities qualify? I think similar to our first question, a lot of these options, they are eligible project ideas as long as they, fall within the intent of the grant. I think first, a reminder that age itself, so just older population, is not a disability, but So you'd have to narrow in on specifically, older people with vision disabilities or older people with mobility disabilities. Um, so those kind of things. But, you know, with that specification, if they, after your conversation, um, clarified that what they needed, most of all for accessibility, was revamping of your computer area, um, to improve accessibility in the library, then yes, that would qualify. We are looking for a grant that would help us improve our outdoor ramp and possibly a chairlift to help our library be more accessible for our physically disabled patrons. Listening to this, it seems that we may not be chosen as the focus is reaching new patrons. I would not say that's true. That sounds like a fantastic project idea. I think a major part of this is reaching, um, a portion of your patrons that you cannot reach because they can't accessibly, you know, participate in programs or services or physically attending your library. So I think that could be potentially a very good project. So I would encourage you to apply with that project idea. Um, okay. Eligibility question. Can we pay an architect for facility update planning and design services? I've seen a couple of questions about this, like hiring a consultant, or someone to, an ADA consultant to review. Absolutely, that is an eligible expense, that you can use funding for. Let's see. Where is the best source of information? I'm not sure if there is a source of information on the number of, you know, people who are disabled in your area. Um, for general demographic information, you can always look at your census. But I'm trying to think about disability demographic information.
Yeah, we can
Um,
take that question to our accessibility manager and get back to you. I know that we only have about 8 minutes left. So, and I see we have like 30 questions.
I know I'm
So
trying to
we
get through
likely, no,
them.
no, no worries. So we likely won't get through all the questions, but what we'll do is we'll download a copy of the Q&A and answer them offline for the ones that we're unable to get to in this session and send that out with the link to their webinar recording.
Yes. And in general, would ebooks and downloadable audiobooks be eligible? Again, it could be potentially eligible, if that is specifically, a project asked for by your primary audience. We had a project where the primary audience was people with low vision, and blindness, and expanding the audiobook selection at the library was a big thing that they were interested in. So audiobooks was a big part of the project. And so, yes, that was really eligible. But if it's not important to your primary audience, then, you'd have to switch gears on your project. Um, Someone asks, what is being asked for when the application mentions dynamics in describing our library?
Yeah, so dynamics are what we mean by that is if there's anything that the reviewer should be aware of, for instance, if your library is the only meeting spot within the town, and that is where everyone comes to do anything from just like bringing their coffees to have a chit chat in the morning or having town meetings, that's an important dynamic to for reviewers to understand. Same with if your library is the location that various organizations from your community go to host conversations or events, that is also good for the reviewers to know, just because that shows how the reviewers are peer reviewers, so they are library workers themselves, so they understand how critical the library is as a central hub to a community. But I think just elaborating on those dynamics is useful for the reviewers to see, in particular because every community is, of course, unique, and rural communities especially play a unique part with the library, oftentimes as the only institution nearby for these types of things.
Um, One person asked, I've been told that our library does not have a tax ID that is separate from the city. Would this be an issue when applying? No. We've had several grantees that, um, when they are paid, we are technically paying the city. Um, I think a similar question that comes to mind is libraries asking, is it an issue if they technically don't own the building? Also not a problem. Many of our grantees also are in that situation, so not an issue. Let's see. A lot of questions about facility upgrades. Those are definitely allowable projects, but just like we've discussed with all other project ideas, um, as long as they are what your primary audience is interested in. So just kind of in general, as you can apply with this project idea, um, and maybe, I would say a good idea is discussing with, some patrons with disabilities in your primary audience, this project idea, just to get a feel if it's even on the right path, apply. And then when you host your conversation, either you're going to hear, yes, this is what we want, and you'll go forwards with exactly what you planned, or you're going to hear, we want something different, and then you change your project. And we're really flexible. We've built in flexibility for this. A lot of people have changed their project in the previous two rounds. Um, so, all of these ideas are potentially good, options. But as long as they are what your primary audience says they want after their community conversation, yeah, then you can go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And I know that we only have one more minute left. As I said, we still have a lot of questions in the Q&A, so we'll go ahead and save those, answer those in a Word doc, and send them out with the webinar, which will be available shortly. Also, just to reiterate what Kayleen just said, we're really trying to emulate the disability justice movement's motto, which is nothing about us without us. So we really want to highlight how critical it is to make sure that you are getting feedback on your plans from the people that you seek to serve, because oftentimes they will highlight some things that you wouldn't even have thought of, and prevent you from also potentially wasting resources on something that does not work for the people that you were seeking to serve. We've heard a lot of people have said that they went ahead and built something to ADA compliance, and then they found out that the audience that they were seeking to serve use electric wheelchairs, and ADA guidelines do not accommodate electric wheelchairs. It's narrower than that. So um, that could have been prevented through just a conversation. So make sure that you are including things like that and keeping the eye on that. So with that, we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank you all for attending today's session. We will be sharing out the recording, the questions, and a copy of the slides shortly after this. Also, thank you again to Kayleen for all her help on this session. And we are looking forward to reading your proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.